Funding for Frontline is provided by the Park Foundation, committed to raising public awareness, with additional funding for this program from the Nathan Cummings Foundation. Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
After 5 years of terror alerts,
the four may be headed to the city of Boston with plans to carry out some sort of an attack.
And hundreds of arrests.
In the course of the last year, half a dozen plots have been disrupted where there was an intention to kill people.
Is Al-Qaeda in America?
People talk about sleeper cells and all of that. We didn't find any.
There is no Al-Qaeda in the United States. Is that true?
Tonight, Frontline correspondent Lowell Bergman and the New York Times investigate the government's campaign against terror here at home.
A homegrown terrorist cell, and they viewed themselves as Al-Qaeda of California.
The cases.
Various individuals connected to Al-Qaeda have been operating in the Lodi area.
The charges.
They were being trained on how to kill Americans.
The doubts.
I'm not a terrorist. My son is not a terrorist.
And the tough questions.
These are not real terrorist threats.
About the enemy within. Since 9/11, America has been on alert, in fear of another attack. For 5 years, the fear has gripped our cities. Could there be another terrorist sleeper cell in our midst? That fear hovers along the border, where more than 1 million people try to cross illegally every year. And the worst fear is that a terrorist will join them. In January 2005, that fear seemed to become all too real when a frantic call came in from Mexico to a 911 operator in California. The caller reported that he had just helped 4 Chinese chemists and 2 Iraqis cross illegally into the United States. He said that his trafficking organization was about to smuggle a nuclear device into the United States, that the Chinese and the Iraqis were then going to take to Boston. FBI agents Mark Nichols and Jeff Taylor raced to the scene early the next morning.
You know, we were frightened. We were coming out here hoping not to find anything. The caller was very specific with the location where he threw this bag over the fence. And as you can see from taking a look around, there was probably hundreds of white plastic bags at the time. So we're just looking at one bag after another, and just when we were getting ready to leave is when we actually found the bag.
So a bag like that?
Very similar to that. It was actually smaller than that, and it was tied off at the top, just like a little white grocery shopping bag. We had gloves on. We were able to just take a quick look to see in there without opening the whole thing up, and we actually saw a picture of what appeared to be a Chinese or an Asian individual.
Inside the bag, agents found airline tickets and 4 visas for Chinese nationals.
We were almost speechless. We could not. We looked at each other like, you've got to be kidding me, because it appears that it's exactly as he described.
The agents sounded the alarm, and hundreds of officials on both sides of the border were mobilized in an effort to track the suspects and search for the nuclear weapon.
We jumped on it immediately with all of the resources that we had in trying to determine whether it was in fact accurate or whether it was a complete hoax.
Were you worried for your family?
Absolutely.
These are the photos the FBI released of the 4 Chinese nationals they call possible terror suspects. Agents believe the 4 may be headed to the city of Boston with plans to carry out some sort of an attack.
In Washington, at the National Counterterrorism Center, the new clearinghouse for all threats to America, intelligence officials huddled around the clock to evaluate the threat to Boston.
The judgment was that this may be al-Qaeda leveraging alien smuggling operations of some sort from the southern border.
The threat quickly became a national story.
Special teams were patrolling the streets using radiological sensors like these. Bomb squad and other emergency teams were put on standby near City Hall.
Boston went on high alert as the city braced for a possible attack.
The thing that keeps me up at night, I think, more than anything else, is probably the worry of a terrorist with a nuclear device in one of our major cities. The effect of that on our democracy, on our economy, on our way of life would be so catastrophic.
The real potential damage is just mind-boggling as far as the scale. 9/11 was a tragedy, it was awful, but there's a lot worse that al-Qaeda could do.
In the world of counterterrorism, there are many unknowns, and often nothing is as it seems. Back on the border, Mexican authorities finally located the 911 caller. He was an illegal alien smuggler trying to get revenge on some business associates, and confessed he made the whole thing up. It was a deliberate hoax. And those 4 Chinese chemists, they turned out to be 4 Chinese farmers.
But this is the cost. This is the price that we have to pay at times. There are going to be times we're going to have to go to battle stations, even if the information is of dubious quality, because we don't want to take that risk.
Evaluating intelligence is one of the government's greatest challenges. And one thing they have learned is that some fears are exaggerated. In places like the Mexican border, we may have unexpected allies.
We have had sources indicate to us and tell us that smuggling organizations particularly want to stay away from Middle Eastern individuals or people that they believe may be a threat, because it's just going to bring too much attention from law enforcement on these organizations, both in the United States and in Mexico. They're in it for the profit. They're in it to make money, and these organizations are greedy.
It's bad for business, terrorism, for them.
Absolutely. It is bad for business.
From the very beginning, there was a gap between America's fears and the hard realities of the terrorist threat. After 9/11, the greatest fear was that there were more terrorists like the hijackers still inside the country. More al-Qaeda sleeper cells, hiding and waiting for orders from Osama bin Laden.
In the aftermath of 9/11, we didn't know what we were facing here in the United States. There needed to be every effort made to uncover sleeper cells or al-Qaeda activities here that could have been engaged in much more catastrophic terrorist planning that we had seen on 9/11.
The second wave.
Second wave, right.
But in fact, after a massive FBI investigation, it was discovered that those original fears of an al-Qaeda second wave were unfounded, a conclusion endorsed by the 9/11 Commission.
Do you think that there are sleeper cells in the United States?
We didn't come up with any in the 9/11 investigation.
The whole thing was plotted overseas.
Yes, that's correct.
There were no witting accomplices, apparently, here in the U.S.
No. It was interesting because these people came in to the country to do us harm. Plot was developed in Afghanistan. They came into the country. People talk about cells and sleeper cells and all of that. We didn't find any.
There was a report last year that there was an FBI analysis that there is no true sleeper cell, al-Qaeda sleeper cell in the United States. Is that true?
There's no information to show there is one. The better language would be, we know of no al-Qaeda network in the United States.
But if they know of no al-Qaeda network in the U.S., what do authorities believe is the real threat? The attacks in Madrid in 2004 and in London in 2005 have persuaded U.S. officials that the threat may have morphed, that the real danger now comes not just from al-Qaeda, but from homegrown terrorists.
I was very concerned about what happened in London when 4 individuals who were UK citizens, born and raised in Leeds, carried out attacks against the British subway system. They were under the radar screen of the British police. They were inside of the UK, the United Kingdom. That could be happening here in the United States. Something could be taking place in a small town or city in the Midwest or in the Northeast of individuals who have decided, for whatever reason, that they're going to carry an attack. They're going to blow themselves up because of what al-Qaeda stands for.
You mean the enemy is amongst us?
It could be. The enemy very well may be within our midst.
In December 2001, just 3 months after 9/11, an undercover FBI informant drove into the city of Lodi, California. He had come to launch an investigation that would become one of the FBI's most significant homegrown terrorism cases. Lodi is a city of 60,000 in California's agricultural heartland. An all-American city with the feel of a small town. Early in the last century, Pakistani immigrants began coming here to work in the orchards and fields, becoming an integral part of the community. The Pakistani community has grown in recent years, fed by a steady influx of new immigrants. Until he came to Lodi, the informant, a Pakistani named Nasim Khan, was working as a clerk in a convenience store. The FBI recruited him after he told agents that when he lived in Lodi in the late 1990s, he had seen al-Qaeda's number 2, Ayman al-Zawahiri, at the local mosque.
That obviously perked the interest of the FBI and is what really led directly to his recruitment as an operative for the FBI.
At the same time, the FBI was warned that the local imam at the mosque, Muhammad Ali Khan, was linked to radical elements in Pakistan.
Mr. Khan's father runs a madrassa in Pakistan, a holy school in Pakistan. And in 1998, when bin Laden issued his fatwa against the West, he was asked which Islamic scholars or intellectuals supported him in that fatwa. And he specifically mentioned the scholars at Mr. Khan's father's madrassa.
Then another Pakistani imam, Shabir Ahmed, arrived at the Lodi Mosque. The FBI was concerned because back home he had given a fiery anti-American speech.
Mr. Ahmed probably should have never been let into this country, but it was something that happened, and once he was here and we became aware of his presence and we became aware of the speech, we certainly kept a very close eye on him at that time.
When the FBI sent their undercover informant to Lodi, his first assignment was to befriend the two imams. He reportedly moved into this apartment behind the mosque. He told the imams he was a computer engineer and would set up a website for the new madrassa, the religious school they planned to build in Lodi. The informant secretly searched the imams' offices and computers and recorded his conversations with them.
Testing, 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 testing. Hello, 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 testing, testing. Today is Tuesday, March 11th.
The FBI installed wiretaps on their phones and bugs in their offices. The investigation would continue for years.
We have to collect intelligence. We have to understand the nature and the scope of the activities. Absolutely. We have to know everything this person is involved in if we suspect them in supporting or being part of a terrorist operation. We need to find a way of defining the nature of the network. Who else is there?
The informant also began to talk with young men in the mosque, befriending them and probing their interest in jihad. One of them was 19-year-old Hamid Hayat, who had dropped out of school in the 6th grade. The informant also befriended the Hayat family. Umar Hayat, Hamid's father, had emigrated from Pakistan and become a U.S. citizen. He worked as an ice cream truck driver and raised his family in Lodi. He thought of Nasim Khan as part of the family.
He was calling me a dad, and he was calling to my wife a mom. And he was a best friend and Hamid.
The time is 10:45 a.m. and I'm going to meet Hamid.
The informant would hang out at Hamid's house, talking about cricket and girls. But secretly, he was recording their conversations, posing as a radical Muslim, encouraging Hamid to talk about politics and jihad.
No, man. पूरे दुनिया की क्या तो मुसलमान माने हमला की कर को मुल्क माने कना मुल्क माने हर यो मुसलमान माने फर्ज है जिहाद.
In 2003, the Hayat family left Lodi to travel to their home village in Pakistan for Hamid's arranged marriage. After his father returned to California, Hamid stayed on. He was supposed to be studying the Quran, but spent much of his time hanging out with his friends. While Hamid was in Pakistan, the informant continued to call him from California, recording their conversations. Nasim Khan talked to Hamid about attending a jihadi training camp.
No, vacation. Pakistan we're wasting time. I can't do nothing, man.
Hamid would stay with his wife in Pakistan for 2 years, taking care of his ill mother. Then, in the summer of 2005, he returned to the United States. By now, the government suspected that Hamid Hayat had been recruited by those 2 Lodi imams for violent jihad in America.
It is an attempt by a group of radical Islamic religious figures to come to this country and sort of off the radar screen in an off the beaten path location like Lodi to establish a madrassa to serve as a recruiting ground to eventually dispatch young men over to Pakistan for training with the potential to come back here and do some very bad things.
Less than a week after Hamid returned, he and his father Umar were interrogated by the FBI and then arrested.
We believe through our investigation that various individuals connected to al-Qaeda have been operating in the Lodi area.
Hamid Hayat was charged with material support of terrorism for attending a jihadi training camp, and both he and his father were charged with lying to the FBI. Hamid was branded a threat to America.
He also confirmed that the camp was run by al-Qaeda operatives and that they were being trained on how to kill Americans.
The authorities also linked the 2 Lodi imams to al-Qaeda, and they were taken into custody by immigration officers.
Federal agents searched houses in rural northern California.
The news reverberated around the world.
a 22-year-old born in California, allegedly admitted he was trained to kill Americans at an al-Qaeda training camp in Pakistan.
Week's arrest in Lodi, 2 men.
Lodi had become an emblem of the FBI's campaign against homegrown terrorism.
The FBI says its investigation is far from over right now.
In the years since 9/11, the FBI has dramatically reorganized itself. Thousands of agents have been shifted into the Counterterrorism Division. And the Bureau is trying to transform itself into a domestic intelligence agency, more like Britain's MI5. A massive effort is underway to retrain FBI agents to become less like cops and more like intelligence officers. A key architect of that transformation is CIA officer Philip Mudd.
How do we train analysts and operators to work together to paint pictures, to hunt the unknown, to understand what's happening in our cities, so that if there is a vulnerability out there that we don't know about now, tomorrow we may have a better prospect of knowing about it.
It's meant a change in priorities. Preventing attacks is now more important than bringing terrorists to trial. The FBI calls it the new paradigm.
If you look at today, criminal prosecution and the collection of evidence is incidental to the prevention mission. It is not the objective. It is not the mission. The mission is prevention.
In the last 5 years, authorities say that using their newly expanded capabilities, they have made arrests in more than 400 terrorism-related cases across the U.S. And with its new paradigm, the FBI says it has disrupted homegrown plots around the country. Last year in Atlanta, 2 young Muslim men were arrested after they had sent surveillance video of government buildings in Washington, D.C. to a radical Muslim website.
Is this size?
Yes, this size. What, the bomb? Yes.
Is this big?
In New York, surveillance video recorded by an undercover informant helped convict a young Pakistani immigrant who had agreed to carry a backpack bomb in an attack on the Herald Square subway station. And in Miami, 7 members of a group calling itself the Sea of David, who operated out of this warehouse, were arrested after they reportedly told an undercover FBI informant they wanted to bring down the Sears Tower in Chicago. In Washington, the government trumpeted what seemed to be a major terrorism case.
The defendants also face a maximum of 20 years in prison on each charge of a conspiracy to destroy buildings by use of explosives and conspiracy to levy war against the United States.
But since the arrests in Miami, many questions have been raised about how serious a threat this really was.
In the Miami case, the 7 individuals had absolutely no connection with al-Qaeda. It was basically informants that may have goaded these individuals to say stupid things. And it was more a case of incitement, if anything, as opposed to finding a real, clear, imminent threat against the United States.
Critics argue that it is not just Miami, that many of the government's domestic terrorism cases have been overblown.
It's a disservice to the American people because when they hear on the news or see in the newspapers that 7 people, 8 people have been arrested and they have been accused of terrorism, that they talked about blowing up major office buildings or hospitals, it frightens the heck out of the American people. And then those cases, it turns out, have been a lot less than what was advertised.
A recent study of the government's 441 terrorism-related cases by New York University's Center on Law and Security shows that almost all of the cases involve lesser charges, like visa violations and financial fraud, not acts of terrorism.
And you're saying these are not really substantial cases? Wow.
There are some substantial cases. There's a lot of evidence that we're not allowed to see, but in terms of what we've been able to see, you could not make the determination that there had been a number of substantial cases. When you use the number 441, if you want to deduce from that what are the successful cases, you could count them on 2 hands.
I sometimes see people criticize us for having counterterrorism cases that result in relatively modest criminal prosecutions, I look at that and applaud it. That means we prevented before it reached a level where it's a headline type counterterrorism prosecution. I'd prefer not to do counterterrorism or terrorism prosecutions. I'd prefer to bust conspiracies so early that someone doesn't have access to a weapon.
To rebut the criticism that most of their cases do not involve an imminent threat, FBI officials point to the JIS case in Los Angeles.
I think if you look at the JIS case of all of the terrorist plots since 9/11, it is probably the one that operationally was closest to actually occurring.
Meaning?
Meaning they had selected targets, they had chosen dates, they had obtained weapons, they had written down plans, and they were getting very close to actualizing the plot.
The JIS case began when local police were investigating a series of gas station robberies.
During one of those robberies, they collected evidence that led to one of the suspects. They began a surveillance of that suspect, went back to that suspect's residence.
To their surprise, inside the apartment, police say they found evidence of a terror cell, a poster of Osama bin Laden, ammunition, bulletproof vests, and a hit list of possible attack sites.
The targets were United States military recruiting centers in Los Angeles, the Israeli consulate here in Los Angeles, synagogues, specific synagogues, and the El Al ticket counter at Los Angeles International Airport.
3 young Muslim men were eventually arrested and charged in the case. One of them was an ex-gang member who had converted to Islam in prison. That led the massive investigation, which involved hundreds of law enforcement officials, inside the walls of the California prison system to this man, Kevin James, who the government alleges founded a radical Muslim group called JIS. But the JIS investigation soon took on some of the familiar patterns that have affected other recent cases, as the government publicly linked the group to al-Qaeda.
The picture emerged of a homegrown terrorist cell that had been spawned by a small radical group operating in Folsom Prison. And they viewed themselves as al-Qaeda of California.
Was it linked in any way to al-Qaeda?
It was only linked to al-Qaeda in that they subscribed to the al-Qaeda philosophy. They did not have any contact with any al-Qaeda operatives. They certainly didn't get any instructions or approval to commit this or to hatch this plot from Osama bin Laden.
Investigators suspected that there were as many as 100 Muslim convicts who had some connection to Kevin James and could be part of the terror cell. And FBI Director Mueller repeatedly warned Americans about the threat growing inside the prisons.
Inmates may be drawn to an extreme form of Islam because it may help justify their violent tendencies. These persons represent a heightened threat because of their criminal histories, their propensity for violence, and their contacts with fellow criminals.
Allahu Akbar.
Although the FBI says its investigation is still ongoing, after more than a year, it has not yet found a widespread conspiracy inside the prison system.
In the JIS case and the subsequent investigations that you were involved in, it turned out that there wasn't a great network inside the prisons. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In the end, the government indicted only 4 men, Kevin James and the 3 gas station robbers, on terrorism charges. They have all pled not guilty.
The operational piece of it that was on the street involved, as far as we can tell at this point, the people charged. But I don't think for the potential victims in a case like that, it would have much mattered to them if they were killed by a group of 4 people or killed by a group of 4 people that was part of a larger group.
Look at the LA black prison gang that was holding up gas stations.
That's not al-Qaeda, is it? You can't say there aren't going to be threats, traditional threats. from all sorts of sources within the country, going back to the Haymarket explosion in Chicago back 2 centuries ago. I mean, we've had anarchists, we've had people trying to do harm for one reason or another. But we're talking about here is a specific organization that's now around the world in its scope that has announced they want to do us harm and kill as many Americans as possible, that has technology to support them, and has some very intelligent people who are working to do us harm. And that is the enemy. And that is who we're fighting. And we've got to always keep our focus on that.
In February 2006, when the Director of National Intelligence, John Negroponte, came to Capitol Hill to deliver his annual threat assessment, he highlighted just 2 cases as examples of homegrown terrorism: the JIS prison investigation and the Lodi case.
A network of Islamic extremists in Lodi, California, for example, maintained connections with Pakistani militant groups, recruited United States citizens.
Just 2 weeks later, the trial of Hamid Hayat for supporting terrorism and his father Umar for lying to the FBI began in California. As federal prosecutors laid out their case against Hamid, they introduced into evidence a scrapbook found in his home.
This is a young man, when his residence was searched, had in his possession essentially scrapbooks full of newspaper clippings and documents, other kinds of things, that espoused a very violent version of Islam and jihad.
The jury heard conversations that had been secretly recorded by the informant, Nasim Khan, including this one in which Hamid gloats over the brutal assassination of Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl. And the jury was shown the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence, confession videos of both Hamid and Umar Hayat, in which they describe going to training camps.
Yeah, my understanding, Hamid, is that you attended some camps. Okay. And that's true, right? And so why don't you tell me, so I know where you're coming from. Bring me up to speed a little bit on the camps that you attended.
You mean what kind of camp were they?
Yes.
They were like training camps.
Okay.
When I heard that these 2 gentlemen were being prosecuted down in Lodi, I thought these gentlemen are probably going to be convicted, because when the U.S. attorney decides to prosecute somebody, they almost always have the evidence.
James Weddick is a highly decorated veteran of 35 years in the FBI, where he specialized in complex corruption and fraud cases and had extensive experience handling informants. A year after he retired, Weddick agreed to review the videotaped confessions as a favor to an old friend, one of the Hyatt's defense attorneys.
He asked me what my professional opinion was and whether or not I thought the gentleman would be convicted if they used these video confessions. I spent a weekend looking at the video confessions. I was shocked, because what I saw was something rather unprofessional.
You come back to the U.S. after you've done your training. You're ready for jihad.
Right now? Over here?
Yes.
Over here?
Yes.
No, I'm not ready for jihad. You know.
That's what they train you for. That's.
You can hear the agents literally dictate to him what it is that they thought he was involved with.
You came to the United States. Mm-hmm. You know, they sent you off. You know, Allah Akbar. You know, you've got to go to jihad. Mm-hmm. And you left with marching orders.
What's that?
You know what that is?
No.
That's, here's what your mission. Here's what you do. Here's what you do with all this training we've done for you.
You can hear in the agent's tone of their voice. They're angry when it doesn't come back exactly the answer they want. In other words, he's engaged in terrorist activities.
Yeah. Who's going to tell you? Because they're not going to. Are they going to call you up from Pakistan? I don't think so. I think somebody.
Maybe send a letter or anything like that. Maybe.
I don't think they're going to send a letter. They're not going to. We're not going to write down a little note. Go do this. I think you're going to have to talk to somebody
here in Lodi.
They're leading him, and it's ridiculous. It's shameful. It's shameful, because I've never seen a department do this before.
I just got called in here, so I'm a little behind the curve a bit.
The FBI agents involved in the interrogations declined to be interviewed. The tapes had been recorded after Hamid and his father voluntarily came in for questioning. Initially, Hamid denied going to a camp. It was only after several hours of questioning that he changed his story and the videotaping began. In another room, the FBI was questioning Omar Hayat. He denied that his son had been to a terrorist training camp. But after they showed him Hamid's confession, Omar changed his story and said that he too had visited camps.
Okay, so you actually went into a building, downstairs into a basement?
Yes, sir.
And you could look through gates and see people shooting?
Yes.
Must have been very loud in there.
Oh, yeah. Must have been best louder.
You get to shoot the guns? You get to fire them?
I don't. I just watching it, you know.
Umar described a radically different scene than his son, a huge underground shooting range and training facility at one of the camps.
So let's talk about what you saw at the camp.
I saw, they put that cover to the people like Ninja Turtle, they was trying to stick like here and jump maybe 16 feet over there.
That's so just like a vaulting pole?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Must have been very tall ceilings. So this is a very deep basement.
Very deep basement, yes. Very deep basement, yes.
Well, certainly, there's no question that parts of Umar Hayat's interview were questionable. Certainly the pole jumping in a basement and those things.
The Ninja Turtles and the high ceiling.
There's no question about that. On the other hand, you have to ask yourself, why would a man who's been living in the United States for many decades, was here on 9/11, why would he say that his son has attended a terrorist training camp if it wasn't true? It makes no sense. There's no logic to that.
The defense argued that Omar Hayat's descriptions of the camp were so odd because after many hours of interrogation, he, as well as his son, had simply made up stories to please the FBI.
Did you see a President Bush dummy?
Oh, yeah.
So that's and lots of them. Lots of them had.
Yeah. And they put it cross on it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's what they're shooting at, right? Because that's the enemy.
I think if you look at the taped, recorded confessions, you'll see that they more or less answered the way the Bureau wanted them to answer. They were attempting to go back to their house. That's all they wanted to do was go home.
Rumsfeld? Yeah, they take the dummy over there too. I saw that.
You saw Rumsfeld dummy?
Yeah.
They had no thoughts that if they cooperated with the FBI, that either of them would spend the rest of their lives in jail. It never, ever occurred to them.
And there were also serious problems with the FBI informant, Nasim Khan, starting with that sensational claim that he had seen Ayman al-Zawahiri at the Lodi mosque.
It's not true, right? He didn't see him.
I think that's correct. That's correct. I think it's a situation of a mistaken identification.
Wouldn't that affect his credibility? That he might be just trying to please his employer, who eventually would pay him hundreds of thousands of dollars?
Well, I think certainly anytime you're using a confidential informant, the credibility of what that person is saying to you matters.
And then there were the tapes of the informant talking to Hamid in Pakistan, in which Nasim Khan was browbeating him about attending a madrassa and going to a jihadi camp.
Yeah, inshallah, when I come to Pakistan and I see you, I'm going to force you to get you from your throat and throw you in the madrassa, in your grandfather's madrassa.
I'm not going to go with it.
Oh, yeah, you will go. Yeah, you will go. You know what? Maybe I can fight with you in America, but I can beat your ass in Pakistan, so nobody's going to come to your rescue.
He is leading Hamid, right? When are you going to a camp? I can't even say on PBS the language he used a number of times, trying to get him to go to a camp.
That is correct. Certainly we wish other things had occurred on some occasions during the course of those conversations. But the fact of the matter is, this is a confidential informant. He's working undercover. He is not a trained law enforcement officer. He's serving a purpose for the FBI. And these things never go exactly as prosecutors would hope that they would.
In the end, the government produced no direct evidence to corroborate Hamid and Umar's confessions, to confirm that they had actually been at a training camp.
In a criminal investigation, during the arrest process, we take a confession. We always review that confession later on and try to corroborate whatever is said, no matter how small the detail, no matter what the investigation is. Here, they did not corroborate anything that was said during those interviews.
The defense wanted to put James Weddick on the stand to testify as an expert witness, but the judge ruled that the value of his testimony was, quote, outweighed by its potential for confusing the jury, end quote. So they never heard his scathing critique of the FBI's investigation.
Mr. Weddick told us that he was shocked at the nature of the interrogations, at the nature of the informant's conversations with Hamid, and because it was clear that these people were telling all kinds of different stories to please.
Well, Mr. Weddick is certainly entitled to his opinion, and I respect his opinion, but I also respectfully disagree with it, and I think the jury did as well.
After 9 days of deliberation, the jury convicted Hamid Hayat of material support of terrorism and lying to the FBI. He now faces a possible 39-year sentence. His appeal is ongoing. Umar Hayat's case resulted in a hung jury, and the prosecution decided not to try him again when he agreed to plead guilty to an unrelated charge of lying to a customs officer.
I'm not a terrorist, and my son is not a terrorist, and they were not believing me. They were not believing the truth, so what am I going to do then?
And what about those two Lodi imams, who were the initial targets of the investigation? Despite years of secret wiretapping, break-ins, and surveillance, the government still did not have enough evidence to charge the imams with anything related to terrorism.
So ultimately, the decision was made to deport them rather than criminally prosecute them.
So you couldn't indict the imams
That's
based
correct.
on anything they did or you had collected at that point?
That's correct.
So you have your two big fish, if you will, and you have to let them go?
Well, I don't know if, there's a difference between let them go right back out onto the street in Lodi as opposed to sending them back to Pakistan. Ultimately, that was the decision that was made.
In this new paradigm, why wouldn't you watch all of that so you could infiltrate the jihad in order to find out what's going on, since you were so on top of this situation?
It's not that simple at the time when you're trying to make these decisions, and it does come back to the ultimate objective, which is to detect and deter these things from happening. And we have absolutely accomplished that in this circumstance.
When you look at this case as a whole, based on your experience in the FBI, what were they really after? Why did they wind up with the Hayats?
They were the last men left. The imams had been deported. They had not developed any evidence suggesting anybody else was here in the United States awaiting to commit jihad. They had paid more than almost $250,000 to a government informant, and they had to bring about charges concerning someone.
What was the reaction in the FBI when they found out you were working for the defense?
Not happy.
Did you make a lot of money on this case?
None. I'm doing it simply because they're not guilty.
And finally, what about the government's dramatic claim that they had discovered al-Qaeda operatives in Lodi, California?
He also confirmed that the camp was run by al-Qaeda operatives and that they were being trained on how to kill Americans. I think it's unfortunate that that term was used, but it was a very fluid situation. So I do regret it from the perspective of the potential for too much concern by the public in this circumstance in terms of, because in the post 9/11 world, you say al-Qaeda, your average person on the street has a certain connotation in their mind's eye. And I regret that.
But that caused international headlines. So there is public influence that takes place, publicity. That would influence a jury, right?
Anytime there is a case of this level of public interest, whether it's a particularly egregious capital murder case in a small town, or whether it's a matter that you've just described, there's always going to be a lot of public interest in this matter. And as I have said, I think hindsight being 2020, we should not have said that at the opening press conference.
So I get this accurately. There has not been, nor is there, an al-Qaeda cell in Lodi, California.
That's correct.
In Lodi, the impact of the investigation and trial is still reverberating through the city's Muslim community. Umar Hayat is back in town. He spent almost a year in jail awaiting his trial before he was released. He lost his home and is now living in a garage.
I lost my business, I lost my name, everything I lost it. See, I'm living with my family in the garage right now.
Did you actually go to a camp?
No.
And see training?
Never.
Never?
Never.
So why were you saying yes and describing?
I just make a story, that's all. Because they was not believing me when I was telling the truth. I'm American citizen, this is my country. I love my country. I'm not expecting those kind of things. Even I never think in my life like this kind of thing, the one they put on me and my son, the terrorist world. We never think even like those kind of stuff. Yeah, it was a nightmare for us.
What happened to the Hayats has left the Pakistanis in Lodi wary. Many people here would not talk with us on the record about the case. But most, like Taj Khan, a retired engineer and longtime resident, believe the Hayats are innocent.
According to the FBI allegations, they are supposed to be terrorists. The community doesn't believe that. Nobody in the community believes that.
Nobody?
Nobody. Not one person that I know. And I know hundreds of people.
And the alienation that we hear in the Muslim community in Lodi, that the government went after an ice cream truck driver and his lazy son and made it into a national case. Do you hear that around the country?
Oh yeah, definitely. That's the perception within the Muslim American community, that these are not real terrorist threats that they're talking about. These people are guilty of stupidity, guilty of saying dumb things, wrong things. But are they al-Qaeda conspiracies that are part of this larger network in the United States? I don't think you'd find many people believing that right now.
American Muslim leaders believe the FBI's aggressive investigative focus on their communities is misplaced, because Muslim communities here are very different from those in Europe that have spawned deadly attacks.
These enclaves in Europe are really ghettos. They are isolated physically from the rest of society. In America, it's very different. We've had an affluent and highly upwardly mobile Muslim American community that is relatively well educated. And so there's a different sense here. And the question is, should we look to Muslim Americans as partners in the war on terror or suspects in the war on terror?
You're sitting in the Muslim community and you're already feeling vulnerable, obviously. You're already feeling you're under scrutiny, obviously, right? And you see arrests, for instance, of an ice cream truck driver and his son. You understand when you then hear also there is warrantless eavesdropping going on and so on, you're a target. You're a target.
Look,
and it would be harder for you to recruit sympathizers as a result in those communities.
It is harder. And I receive the phone calls and have the contacts with the community that feels that way. And I get that, rightfully so, but none of it is done with malice. None of it is done with bias.
It's a very careful balance that needs to be struck. You don't want to in any way alienate American Muslims, the international Muslim community.
We have a lot of the American Muslims we talk to are pretty alienated with some of the cases that have been made, some of the publicity about their communities.
And it's very unfortunate that there may have been some heavy-handed measures in the aftermath of 9/11 because we didn't know what we faced here. And if there were actions that were taken that shouldn't have been taken against American Muslims, well then that's a real problem.
At the heart of the homegrown terrorism cases like Lodi lies an uneasy question. After 5 years, have we struck the proper balance between the investigative power of the government and the reality of the threat we face?
After almost 5 years, the people who have been arrested, tried, convicted, do not bespeak a major terrorist community in the United States. And the American people, I think, slowly are starting to realize that these cases are being brought, being advertised or described as one thing, and then they end up being something else, and credibility is suffering.
I spend every day looking at information that says that people are still trying to come after this country, and that there are people inside this country who want to commit acts of violence as a result of an ideology that inspired 19 hijackers. I wouldn't worry about it. That's our mission, to deal with that kind of problem. But to suggest to people seriously that that doesn't exist here, I would say would be incorrect.
In the course of the last year, half a dozen plots have been disrupted where there was an intention to go forward and kill people. And those people aren't dead. They're alive and walking around today. Shows that we're doing something right with the intelligence.
Well, that's the problem. I mean, when you say disrupt the plot, the second thing you look at and say, was the plot real? I mean, frankly, you got a lot of nuts in this country, unfortunately. We're always talking about doing this or that, the bomb threats that occur all around New York and Washington and other places. So when you say disrupted something, you've got to say, is it real?
You're skeptical.
Yes, I am. You can cry wolf once too often, and then people stop paying attention. So we've got to be very, very serious about what's credible and what's not credible.
Terrorism, can be a rallying cry for political purposes. I don't think that we should hype the threat in order to gain sort of political advantage in any way. Anybody should do that. There is a legitimate concern about terrorism. However, you don't want to overhype it. And I think there has been some of that over the past couple of years.
This report continues on our website, where you can watch the full program again online in high-quality video.
They're not guilty.
Read the interviews with experts on U.S. anti-terror efforts and the Lodi case.
But this is the cost.
Explore more about the Muslim community of Lodi, the FBI's new approach, and the domestic terrorist threat. Then join the discussion about this report at pbs.org.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Park Foundation, committed to raising public awareness, with additional funding for this program from the Nathan Cummings Foundation. Frontline is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.